And welcome back to the Keys to Therapy. Today's episode is all about graduating from grad school. So, we're going to cover a couple different topics: how to prepare for graduating, what first jobs can be like, what things to get you through the first couple years after grad school, especially if you decide to get licensed, and what tips and tricks can make all of this stuff easier, because it's an extremely stressful time for most people. So, first, what we're going to talk about is before graduation. So I would say probably 3 to 6 months prior to graduating, start getting some of these things in place. So the first thing I would suggest is to start working on your resume. This may be during like Christmas break, spring break. Start getting a resume together. Now, you might not have a whole lot on there, especially if you went to school and like bachelor's degree and then went straight into grad school. But whatever you could put on there, put on there. I know in undergrad, my first like official job was working at Old Navy. So, I would spin it on my resume like customer service and de-escalating customers who were flipping out, but in more professional language. Anything that you could see would be a people skill. You can twist it. And I can guarantee most jobs, especially customer service type jobs, are going to have a way that you can put in there some sort of skills that you possess related to people, professionalism, things like that. So I would start working on the resume and include things from both your internships, some of the tasks that you did, some of the things you were responsible for, things along those lines, because internships absolutely count as experience. So I would start working on that resume. It also helps you start getting in the mind frame of like selling yourself, because that's kind of what you have to do when it comes to job interviews, right? You have to show why you're a really good candidate. And most people feel a lot of people, I would say, feel insecure coming out of grad school because you're like, oh, I'm a baby therapist. Like, I don't really know what to do. So if you start working on some of that mindset by getting your resume together months ahead of time, you're going to feel a lot more prepared when you hit that part of life with interviewing. So number 1, resume. Number 2, look up the licensing requirements in your state. That should definitely be done 6 months, latest kind of 3 months before graduation. Sometimes with some of the licensure stuff, there's certain things that they're going to require from you, like transcripts or professional recommendations, professor recommendations, things along those lines. And you're going to want to get some of that into place as you are talking to these people and seeing them on a daily basis. Usually, too, most grad school programs have some sort of like capstone thesis, something along those lines that you're doing that last semester of school. And so that's another thing that adds to the stress of the end of grad school. So if you can go ahead and get some of those things together before you graduate and take your time with it, that will be really helpful too. The third thing is to gather all of that information. So number 2, you're looking up all the stuff. Number 3, you're getting it. So you're building relationships with some professors. Hopefully you've had a good supervisor at your internship that might be able to do recommendation letter for you. And those are just good references to have in general. Maybe your next job is going to want some references, and it's not even the licensing board that wants them, but it's your job that does. And so I think it would be a really good idea to go ahead and start building some of those professional relationships too. That's where you start to see like some of these professors a little bit more like colleagues potentially, because at some point you will be colleagues with them. So that's definitely helpful. Number 4, decide on what type of setting you'd want to work in. I know there was a lot of people in my program who were like, I just need to get a job. I just need to get my hours for licensure. So that's fine too. If you're pretty much open to anything, cool. Then you're going to have a lot more options. But you want to make sure that if you're going to spend potentially like 2 years or so in one job where you probably won't get paid a whole lot and you're going to be kind of stressed, you want to be in a place that is going to be like the least stressful. So I know a lot of the jobs that were available to me at the time as a provisionally licensed therapist, I know some states call them residents. Most of those jobs tended to be intensive in home. I did not want to drive from house to house, going and seeing different families and then getting back in the car and going and doing that again. So that was my last option for that. But for some people, they were like, that's fine, or I really need the money, or I really want the hours, and it's short term anyway. So just think about what type of setting you'd want to be in. And what your strengths are when it comes to that, because you want to know that you are going to be comfortable there. You don't want to burn out as you're just starting in this field. So really consider what type of setting. Do you want to work with kids? Do you want to work with adults? Do you want to work in a hospital? Do you know, all of those things. So really think that through. And the next step would be to start looking up job listings. And I would do this again months before you even graduate, just to get an idea of what's out there, get familiar with different agency names, different practice names, things like that. And sometimes you can see the salary on the listing. Not often enough. People are not transparent enough with what they're willing to pay for these different positions. They'll put the benefits, but they don't necessarily put the salary, which is really frustrating, especially when you're like, I need to make money. So just at least get familiar with some of the settings and places and things like that before you graduate. You may even want to start applying a month or two before graduation, just because some of that stuff takes a while. Worst case, they tell you that they're hiring right now and you can't start yet, but it might be worth it still to apply a month or two out. And the last step is to be organized. So have one specific folder dedicated to all things licensure. You know, print out the requirements, have a copy of your transcript once you get it, list out, I think one of the licensing boards I've heard of, they want a list of all of the classes that you've taken, just to double check that you have the right curriculums for what they're expecting. So have everything while you're in it. Start gathering all of that, because it's a lot harder to go back years later and do it. So I would definitely suggest staying organized. So that's all the before graduation prep. Now, when it comes to your first job, that is an extremely stressful time. Not only is there a lot of insecurity surrounding being a therapist, and now you're not an intern anymore, you're a resident or provisionally licensed therapist, so people are going to expect a little bit more of you. You now have a provisional license to potentially lose. That's really scary. So there's a lot of stuff about that time that is just terrifying. So, you know, really think through what you want that first job to look like, and be a little picky if you can. I think that your happiness is going to be, might sound cheesy, but it's going to really dictate who you are as a therapist. There's an extremely, extremely high rate of burnout in this field. And I think that sometimes because therapists feel like you've got to put the client first, and who's going to help these people, and you know, I've got to be there for everybody and do everything. But if you burn yourself out, you're really not going to be there for anyone, including yourself or your family or your friends. And there's quite a few people I know that have quit this field completely because of the place that they worked, or the people they worked for, more likely, or how much they sacrificed. So you want to be pretty smart and thoughtful about what you decide to pick. So for my first job, like I mentioned earlier, I knew I didn't want to do intensive at home if I could help it. I really wanted a place, and this is lazy, but I didn't care. And I still feel this way. I wanted a place where I could sit, drive to an office, sit there, do my thing all day, and go home. That's what I had been used to at my internship at the hospital. My first year internship, since there was no like home base, we were constantly meeting at a new place, rotating between like 3 or 4 different places to meet, and I really didn't like that. I like consistency, and I knew that that would work best for me and my personality. Some people would hate the office job, so intensive in-home's great because they get to drive around. Other people want to be in a setting like a school because they know they want to be a school counselor, and that's what they focused on in grad school. So where you can, try to be mindful about matching up the setting you want to work in with a setting, the same setting or a similar setting to what your eventual career goals are. And if you don't know what your career goals are, then try to pick a setting that will give you a broad range of experience. So I know most therapists end up at community mental health, and that's where I ended up. So I found a job listing that sounded like it would be more for a counselor, and it said something about driving. I was like, all right, well, let's just see. I'll apply and see what they're talking about. And so I did the interview, and the job was for primarily a driver who then would help assist with this youth substance abuse group. And I did not want to drive a bunch of kids home. I did not want to drive at all, really. So even though it would have been a good fit in some other ways, because I like working with teens, it wasn't for me. So I told them that, and I turned it down even though I had no other prospects and was kind of nervous. I had a few applications floating out there. And the supervisor actually called me and said that there was another job that was coming available that was for a licensed therapist, a provisional licensed therapist. So she asked if I'd be interested in that, and I said yeah. So I was very, very lucky to be able to be in a place where I had my own office, which was a super tiny, I'm pretty sure it was like a storage closet at some point, no windows, pretty dark because I tried to set the lighting with lamps, but I didn't have enough lamps because I had to buy it myself and I didn't have money. So it was everything to me, even though it was like furniture that was probably as old as me at the time. Like it wasn't the greatest, but to me it was like, I'm doing what I love. This is what I've always wanted to do. So it was exciting, but it was also pretty terrifying and intimidating. So at Community Mental Health, the job that they talked to me about was doing the substance abuse counseling group at night in the evenings sometimes. So I'd have to work later hours 3 days a week. And then it was kind of seeing clients one-on-one from ages like 4 and up, which I'd mostly only worked with adults. So that was new for me. But when talking with HR about the job, they offered me $35,000. So this is in community mental health in North Carolina. And this area at the time was a little bit more rural. It was like 30 minutes outside of Charlotte. So to give you guys a baseline, because again, I believe in transparency, I was offered $35,000. I was always told, negotiate. Like you got nothing to lose as long as you're not like really aggressively negotiating. So I said, well, I was kind of hoping closer to 40. And the HR lady said, the best I could do is $36,500. So I was like, okay, I'll take it. At least I negotiated a little bit. But part of the reason I took the job, I expected low pay because that's what kind of told all through grad school. You're not going to make much money in this field. Not true later on, but that's for later videos. That's not true. But in the beginning, when you don't have a full license, you don't expect to make a whole lot. So that made sense to me. That salary was decent. What I appreciated was there was benefits. So that's the other thing to ask. So when you're interviewing for your first job out of grad school, you can't expect low pay probably, but look at what the package is. So for me at that job, supervision was included. Now I needed 1 hour of supervision every 40 hours I practiced. So essentially 1 hour a week. And the minimum for what you could get your license in the time period you could get your license in was 2 years. So you're looking at 1 hour every week for 2 years, possibly a little longer. And that adds up. Sometimes supervisors charge like $100 an hour. I've seen some charge $120, $150, depending on where you live and what their experience is and what they feel like charging. So that completely adds up over time. So yes, the base salary ended up being $36,500, but I had health insurance offered to me. I worked half days on Fridays because I worked later throughout the week. So I worked 8 to 6 with like an hour lunch, I think, and then 8 to 12 on Fridays. I really liked that idea. The supervision was included. The vacation was like 0.2 hours every 2 weeks. So basically you were never really getting vacation, but they offered paid trainings. So they would have lunch and learns like every month where you could get some CEUs. And each year I was there, they sent me to Asheville for like a long weekend training. So like hotel paid and the training paid and CEUs for me and things like that. So that ended up paying for itself. So again, recommendation wise, don't just look at the salary, look at the entire package. Because if I added up all of the money for the supervision I would have had to pay out of pocket for some of these trainings, the lunch and learns, like it probably would have been 40 something, if not, God, probably more. So definitely look at the entire package and negotiate where you can. So if you are talking to somebody, definitely make part of that interview process. Because remember, you're interviewing them just as much as they are interviewing you. So ask some of those questions. Make sure that you're asking them, what are the hours that you would work? What populations would you work with? What are their expectations for you? Things along those lines, because you want to go in with as much info as possible. So don't feel tempted to just jump in and say yes to the job because they offered it to you. Supervision, super important. That's going to be covered in my next video, but that is definitely a hot button topic that people do not talk enough about. So that's going to be a big factor in the type of job you choose or how your pay works. So talk about that next video. But so the next tip is make sure as you're going into this licensure process or pre-licensure process, you have systems in place. Like I mentioned, for before you graduate, there's a lot of stuff that's required to get your provisional license. Well, there's a ton more required for when you are getting that license. So I know for my program, or for my licensure stuff in particular, they wanted a few different things. So the first one was I had to track my hours. So I had a system for that. I was lucky that I was able to track everything. So like phone calls, family meetings, staff meetings, like all of that stuff was able to be included as like clinical stuff. So pretty much almost like all 40 of the hours each week were taken up by clients or meetings or something along those lines. So I was able to track that. So I've heard of some programs being a lot stricter. Or if you work in a setting, like say you jump into private practice right out of grad school, you're not going to work 40 hours a week. You may work 15, 20, 25, like depending on how many clients you have and meetings and things along those lines. So it's going to take you a little bit longer to accumulate hours, though your work-life balance will probably be better in some ways. So consider all of that stuff too. But first, again, have a system in place to track your hours. Have a few systems in place. Have one saved on your computer and have it emailed to you, or in a Google Doc that you can update or print it or something where you are keeping track of this, because you absolutely don't want to lose that. So have that in place. Track your supervision time too. Like I said, for me, I needed 1 hour for every 40 I worked. So make sure you have a place where you are tracking all your supervision dates and times, costs if you're paying out of pocket. Have all of that together, because you're going to need most of that later on. Have a system in place somewhere, calendar, in your phone, something for when your case studies are due, if your licensure board requires that. I know for mine, every 6 months a case study was due. So I would have to submit a case study that I'd written out from a client that I saw, along with like my hours and supervision hours, to the licensing board. So my supervisor and I would review it, she'd sign off on it, and we would send it to the board. So again, that was every 6 months. So you want to make sure that you are tracking that as well, so that you're not missing any of those deadlines. I know for me, I wanted that license as soon as possible, so I was on top of all of those things. The next thing would be have a projected date of completion. Like have a time in mind that you're like, okay, well, if I worked for 40 hours for say 50 weeks of the year, between like holidays, you're off, and vacation time, if you're so lucky to get that in your package for your employment, have a projected date. So if you're like, okay, so for 50 hours or 50 weeks of the year, if I'm doing my 40 hours, then I'll be done in this amount of time. Like have an end date. So if it's, August, 2 years from now, keep that in mind, because it's good motivation as you're getting through all of that. When you're irritated, you got to send a case study to the board because it's one more thing on your plate. But like, all right, I've only got 2 more of these. It makes it a little bit easier to get through that. So make sure that you're keeping track of that stuff somewhere, and have like that end goal in mind. I don't care if you got a poster board on the wall that's like when I should finish, because you are going to want to know that there is an end date to this stuff. And the last tip for these systems is have a designated time to study for the exam. The licensing exam's stressful for most people because it's expensive and it feels like so much weighs on it. So make sure somewhere in your schedule you have like every Friday afternoon when you would have been at work, but you have a half day like I did. That's when you're studying. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening when you're home from your job, or your lunch break once or twice a week, you're studying. Make sure that you're getting that in there too, because sometimes you're going to be so overworked with the actual job you have, you're going to kind of forget about the licensing exam. So that's my next subject for after graduation, is the licensing exam. It, for me at least, was really stressful. I was scared. Like I was freaked out that I wasn't going to pass. The way that the test worked at that time, I think it's since changed, but you could take it any time in the 2 years once you get your provisional license. So you could take it immediately after graduating, or you could take it like a month before you were going to finish your hours or whatever. But you needed to have it done and passed within like the first 2 years of doing your hours. So from everything I had heard about the test, almost all of it was like scenarios, and then what would you do first or what would you do next. So I wanted to have some practical experience because, like I mentioned in an earlier video, most of grad school was theories. And a lot of the test was not about theories. There was very minimal questions about like medication or theory, like which theory is this? Like there wasn't a whole lot of that type of stuff in there. So you want to make sure that you are actually like thinking about what would you do in this situation. And for me, it was helpful to be in some of those situations and to see how things ran. So I didn't take my licensing exam until a year in. Some people want to take it right out of school while things are fresh, and some people want to take it closer to the end. Totally fine, whatever works for you. But I know that I wanted to have that year of experience under my belt and also have another year to retake it a couple times if I didn't pass it. So definitely look at what your guidelines are for your licensing exam when it comes to licensure, and make sure that you are coming up with a study routine that works for you. And share materials with people, contact people that you went to school with, like make a study group, whichever way works best for you, or combine some different ways, because that test is expensive and nobody's trying to go through that stress all over again. I was lucky that I passed the first time, but when I tell you, like after the test, questions came up before it would give me my score. Questions came up that were like, please review how this testing center did. I was like, I don't care how they did. I want to know if I passed. I was wiping sweaty palms on my pants because I was like, oh my God, if I didn't pass, I'm going to cry. So luckily then it came up that passed. And then, they give you a printout with your score and your picture and all the things. But yeah, it was scary. So make sure you're studying. And like I said, maybe give yourself some room to be able to retake it, just for the peace of mind that you can, if you need to. The last part of this video about after graduation is making sure that you take care of yourself. Like I said earlier, this is a stressful time. It's like you think grad school is really stressful, and then you survive that, and then you're like, oh God, now I'm out in the real world and people are looking at me thinking that I know what I'm doing. A lot of people don't understand the licensing process who aren't in it. So they don't know what provisional license or resident or any of that is compared to license. They're not like, they just want to see somebody, or they just want to get their kid help, or whatever scenario you're working in. So I think it's a lot of pressure, and most therapists want to do really well. I mean, the good ones, like you want to do really well. You want to make sure that you're doing a good job. And the best way to do a good job is to take care of you. So, whatever that self-care process looks like for you, make sure you're doing it at the end of grad school. I remember those last few months, everybody was talking about like, well, here's where I applied, or my internship said that they were going to hire me. And, even though those are great things for them and it's so exciting that they're already going to have a job outside of school, it starts to make everybody else feel bad of like, well, my internship didn't talk about hiring me, or I don't really know where I'm going to work and I don't have all of that situated yet. So you want to make sure that you are dealing with some of those insecurities and fears and worries and whatever that way looks like for you. So maybe that's therapy. Maybe that's venting with some friends. Maybe that's talking with family. I think everybody at that stage is really worried about money. You're worried about your license. You're worried about doing a good job. You're worried about making sense. You're full of imposter syndrome, and you're like, oh my God, people are going to be looking at me like, help me, save my life. And I just graduated like a month ago. So make sure that you've got your own therapy, or, a great supervisor, lots of things in place that are going to help you through that process, because it's a lot. So make sure that you give yourself some breaks where you need and are nice to yourself. I mean, it's what we would tell our clients to do, but we're all kind of hypocritical in like, yeah, I'm telling my client to engage in self-care and take bubble baths, and I'm out here binge eating or whatever it is. Like, we all want to practice what we preach, but that doesn't always happen. But in these situations, especially if you're a baby therapist and you're just starting out, the burnout rate is so high. Like I mentioned earlier, I've known people who've been like, yeah, no, I'm not doing this. Even after they got their license, or right after they got their license, they're like, nah, I'm taking a break. I can't do it. I don't want to do it. So you don't want to enter this field burning out. You want to set a good example for yourself, and also be able to be proud of who you are and what you're doing. And it's going to be easier to be in that mind space if you are recharging somewhere. So definitely take care. But like I mentioned earlier, the next video will be all about supervision. So we'll talk about the ways to utilize that and make the most of that. But, hopefully some of these tips today helped. And subscribe to my channel if you want to get some more info and kind of tag along with this process. But good luck on everything you're doing, and I will see you next episode. Thanks.